Good morning, everybody. This is a live emergency update as we are tracking an intensifying area of low pressure that is moving out of the eastern Gulf of Mexico. It's going to rip across the northern Florida Peninsula overnight tonight and then shimmy up the coastline of Georgia all the way up through coastal South Carolina as well. So this is a live storm chase mode update here, and I am probably considering dropping down to a bit of a sleeper target down in coastal South Carolina during the day tomorrow. So I do think that some of the short-range models are showing some surface-based instability coming ashore on coastal South Carolina, and that's going to be tomorrow, late morning into the afternoon hours. But I'm also monitoring a tornado threat tonight, a nocturnal tornado threat across the Florida Peninsula, and that's a majority of the Florida Peninsula at that, and in fact including cities like Miami, down over toward Fort Lauderdale, Fort Myers, up toward Tampa, even Orlando, up toward Jacksonville, and then as that goes up the coastline of coastal Georgia on Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, moving through coastal South Carolina, including Charleston and Myrtle Beach up toward Cape Fear. I do think there's also going to be a tornado threat up there too. You're just going to have this pipe of convection that is basically ripping off the Gulf Stream, transporting some of those 70 dew points inland as well. And it looks like some of that surface-based instability could even approach the Florence, South Carolina area by Sunday afternoon. So I'm going to give you a detailed breakdown on this tornado potential. I'm going to tell you where my target is storm chase mode wise, probably down in coastal South Carolina. I'm also thinking about dropping down south of Tampa, maybe down toward the Fort Myers area late night tonight, but it all depends on how rapidly that surface low intensifies. Hold on here, just doing a quick little update on my post, and boom, look at that. Let's check out satellite imagery first, and I'm going to break down some of the detailed latest forecast model data as well. So this is all because of this intensifying low pressure over the Gulf of Mexico, and all these yellows, that's a mid-level dry slot, basically an elevated mixed layer that comes in. So this is a mid-latitude cyclone. It's not a warm core hurricane. Thrives off of the temperature gradients that right now are over the Gulf of Mexico this time of year, especially with El Nino, and basically have this dry air that's coming in over top the moisture. We've got a right-moving supercell storm here, very close to the low center, and you can see that thing moving off to the right. Some hot towers out here just in front of it too, in that low-level jet axis. Probably going to be a tornado outbreak today across the open waters of the Gulf of Mexico today, so we'll definitely have to keep an eye on that, as well as those slide off to the northeast. But you can see a lot of worked over air. That's what it's called when you have weak lapse rates downstream. So you have a lot of milky skies, you don't have a lot of surface heating. But let's flip on over to the visible satellite imagery, and we can definitely see that there is indeed some surface heating over the southern Florida Peninsula, and it looks like it's triggering some thunderstorm development too over South Florida. But look at the breaks in the clouds that are basically from Lake Okeechobee off to the south. Basically from here down to the south, you definitely do have some breaks in the clouds over South Florida. And it looks like there's going to be a differential heating boundary that's going to set up, and it's going to be over this same area overnight tonight. To the south of that line, I think you'll get surface-based storms all the way through about midnight, and then right just before midnight and around the midnight hour, I think you'll see a surge in that surface-based instability up through the Tampa Bay area, just as this low is passing a little bit off to the west. Just ahead of that low, you've got a low-level jet that's ripping like 60 to 70 knots, and that's creating wind shear that's favorable for even some supercell storms. And we've also got a couple of supercells, more weakly rotating storms to the south of the Florida Keys that I'm watching very closely as well. And we'll show you that a little bit later on radar. I'm going to talk to you about my storm chasing plan as well. I was basically torn between heading down here to the southwest coast of Florida and ripping those off to the northeast, maybe working that differential heating boundary late night tonight. But I'd probably just be driving around in the rain, in the dark, all night tonight across Florida. But it does look like later on this afternoon and evening, you might also get some bands, multiple rounds of supercell storms, and then eventually that main convective line starts to mature and watches that surface low just rakes right along the coast. Moving all the way up to the South Carolina coastline, you get a reinvigoration of that convection during peak heating on Sunday afternoon. So like Sunday 1, 2, 3, 4 o'clock, You're probably going to see supercell storms moving in off that coastline, right off the Gulf Stream, bringing those 70 dew points inland as well. And the latest model guidance is definitely showing the potential of landfalling waterspouts, big wind, coastal flooding, including the South Carolina coastline through Sunday afternoon and then extending to the northeast of there through the North Carolina Outer Banks. But here's this main convective line that around just before midnight is going to be approaching the west coast of Florida, and that's going to bring a nocturnal tornado threat to the coastline of Florida. But the Florida potential all depends on how quickly that surface low intensifies. And the HRRR model has it kind of diving down into the upper 990s as it moves across the northern Florida Peninsula, dropping down into the mid 990s as it approaches the coastline of South Carolina. But it's possible that it looks like the models are showing favorable wind shear along and to the south of that surface low track, all the way down to the Florida Keys, all the way down to the Everglades. But there you can see that mid-latitude cyclone. Look at it as the winds start to intensify, as that low pressure drops, pressure gradients increase. Look at it increase too downstream. That's that convective line, big southeasterly winds transporting that moisture downstream over eastern South Carolina with time. And this shows you where that surface space instability sets up. Basically anywhere in blue or even gray has the potential of tornadoes. And watch this move on shore here. Eastern South Carolina, Sunday afternoon, extending all the way up toward Cape Fear, eventually up toward the North Carolina Outer Banks. I think there's going to be a convective line late Sunday morning, tomorrow into Sunday afternoon, that rapidly moves off to the northeast. And you're just going to have a conveyor belt of supercell storms moving from the Gulf Stream onshore, eastern South Carolina, possibly producing tornadoes. And also, as that conveyor belt moves through, you're going to have 60 to 70 knot winds maybe onshore there, getting mixed down by that convection, and that's going to lead to coastal flooding situation across eastern South Carolina. Just a conveyor belt of heat and moisture, and also you have that elevated mix layer that moves over top of that. And that's what really creates the instability. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in terms of a sounding profile. But first, this shows you where the surface space instability overlaps with the most favorable wind shear for tornadoes. Watch first how it arrives down in the Tampa Bay area just prior to midnight, like 10-11 p.m. tonight through midnight. And then you're going to see it come ashore again over eastern South Carolina on Sunday afternoon, bringing that tornado potential too. But the nose of that instability goes all the way up to the surface low track, including as it moves right along the coastline of the Carolinas tomorrow. Looking back at the visible satellite, of course, you can see those hot towers, those supercell storms that are over the open Gulf of Mexico. Probably is going to be a tornado outbreak with some of these supercell storms, but it's over the open Gulf of Mexico, so you won't be able to see them. Ships might be able to see them as well, but you can see as that elevated mix layer wraps in to this kind of tilted upper level system, you get that clearing out of the clouds. It carves out the clouds, and then you get the development of instability, and that's happening over the central Gulf of Mexico right now, and also a little bit downstream across Florida too. The southern Florida Peninsula is starting to get some breaks in the clouds over the central and southern portion of the Florida Peninsula. But I think for storm chase mode, I am leaning toward targeting the eastern South Carolina area just because it's daytime. I'll be able to see those landfalling waterspouts, coastal flooding, and I'll be in the middle of the night just driving around in the rain all night tonight if I am down in the Florida area. But I was monitoring this convective line that was approaching the Florida Keys already. It's about noon right now, and you've already got these supercell structures. Look at these little U shapes. You could easily get waterspouts as these come ashore, but not a lot of surface space instability. You can kind of see all these particulates getting lofted, kind of a sign of some weaker low-level lapse rates a little bit. But when you kind of get a little bit of a dry slot coming in, it'll carve out some of the cloudiness. You'll get some heating, and that'll mature some of this convection, and they'll develop almost like these spiral bands coming through the Key West area. I know Mike Tice has the Tice Tower out here in the eastern Florida Keys, up at Key Largo, and I was with Mike Tice on the Storm Rising show that we did in 2020 on National Geographic, and Mike runs a snorkel outfit out there, and he's got a tower that live streams wind data and other meteorological data too. So it's a little bit south of that center, but where that low went last time, that subtropical low that really intensified as it passed over southeastern Florida might got some incredible data from that. Winds gusting over 50 knots out there, and definitely a pretty incredible storm. But beyond the view of radar, you definitely have those storms over the central Gulf of Mexico that we need to keep our eye on. So let's look a little bit closer at some of the forecast models here over the Florida Peninsula. And first I want to show you, this is the forecast dew point map over Florida. Those purples are 70 plus, nice dew points. And you can see some stable air over the Florida Peninsula, especially north of that differential heating line. South of that, dew points are up in the upper 60s, near 70, and you're looking a little bit prior to midnight at about 10 p.m. Eastern time when that deeper moisture finally arrives. So let's look at where the surface low is located at this time at about 10 p.m. There it is, 1,001 millibars. Let's pop over to the 3-kilometer dam, which probably bombs this thing out, 999 millibars. And a lot of times the 3-kilometer dam has difficulty handling the ocean atmosphere interface, and it'll more rapidly intensify these low pressure centers. But you can see that wind shift and the surface pressure falls that precede the low pressure. That kind of projects its track, which is going to be out toward the Nature Coast and across the northern Florida Peninsula, and then eventually right up the coastline of Georgia, 998 low. And it's going to be this pipe that we are going to be watching tomorrow. This pipe of stronger wind, moisture influx, that's going to be coming right in off the Gulf Stream. Look at those dew points. Not as aggressive on the 3-kilometer dam, but you do get a 68, 69 dew point by late morning, moving onshore in the 3-kilometer dam near the Charleston area tomorrow, late morning. But you look at the HRRR model, and it has even better moisture coming onshore, even near 70, cracking 70 there near the Charleston area. And that coastal front invades inland in South Carolina just ahead of that surface low. And you might even get some supercell storms. Look at the HRRR model, bombs this down to a 988 low over Hilton Head Island, moving right along the coast of South Carolina. That's a very strong low pressure center. And ahead of that, you're going to have a lot of strong wind shear, strong onshore flow. These are the surface winds. And it looks like you might even get some instability get carved out right ahead of that path of that 988 low too tomorrow, late morning into the afternoon hours. So I'm keeping an eye on that area, eastern South Carolina certainly. I want to show you quick what the EHIs look like. This shows you where that surface-based instability is coming ashore right there, eastern South Carolina. Look at those yellows. Those are favorable conditions for tornadoes, making landfall off the ocean. You're going to have southeasterly winds, big low-level jet coming in at a slight angle as well. And you're just going to have this conveyor belt of supercell storms making landfall along coastal South Carolina during the day tomorrow. So this is what I think I'm going to cover. I'm going to drop down there for AccuWeather. Right now I'm at our Team Dominator Dixie Alley headquarters, upstate South Carolina. I was thinking about dropping down to the Fort Myers area to cover late night tonight, but this is going to be in the daylight hours. You're going to have that coastal flooding, and I might have the opportunity of getting a landfalling waterspout coastal Carolina tomorrow. If you know anybody that live in this area, share this stream, dominate that like button. But we're watching elevated mix layers here, folks. And that's that dry slot that comes in right here over top that deep moisture, subtropical, tropical moisture there. Dew points near 70. And look at the hodograph curve. Almost looks like something you'd see in the northeastern quadrant of a tropical cyclone. And you're going to have the right mover moving almost due north, a little bit west of due north. Pretty rapid storm motions. That conveyor belt of supercell storms just coming right ashore there. But that's a big 0 to 1 kilometer shear vector. 40 knots. Surfaced wind, southeast at about 20 knots. Just above that, southeast at like 50 knots. Creating quite a bit of wind shear. And you also have some decent storm relative inflow vectors for kind of a subtropical type low, or at least a low like this. Basically a pure El Nino type of a low. Forecast soundings that are right there. That's approaching Myrtle Beach too. But that looks supportive of landfalling waterspouts. And it looks like that environment tries to move inland a little bit. Not quite to Florence, but you actually get that shear vector elongating with that 1 kilometer wind up near 60 knots, folks. Very strong southeasterly 1 kilometer wind at 60 knots. There's your vector. That's over top of surface wind at about 20 knots. So you've got a 40 knot 0 to 1 kilometer shear vector across eastern South Carolina. And we do want to, of course, look at Florida as well. It looks like the instability isn't as robust as that arc lifts up toward the North Carolina Outer Banks, but major coastal erosion expected over that portion. So let's watch Florida tonight. This is at about 10 p.m. The really strong low-level shear is just offshore at this time, but you start to get that surface-based instability bleeding ashore by about midnight near Tampa Bay down toward Fort Myers. Just offshore, you get a rapidly increasing low-level jet, low-level wind shear out there, arc of supercells and convection approaching. But the 850 low kind of has this egg shape on the HRRR, which isn't quite as favorable for the tornado production. If you have more of a compact 850 low, I think that would be more favorable for this nocturnal tornado potential across the Florida Peninsula. But this storm system kind of gets going a little bit later, intensifies over northern Florida, especially as it gets towards South Carolina, reaching the upper 980s. And so that's why I think that the tornado threat could even be a little bit higher across eastern South Carolina. Overnight tonight from Tampa down toward Fort Myers, you're going to have these storms just moving in bands across the Florida Peninsula. But it is a bit more conditional because of this egg-shaped 850 low, slight later intensification of the storm system. The elevated mix layer is lagging a little bit behind the convective line, which is really ripping through western Florida by this time as you're getting a little closer to midnight. Hello? So here's the convective line near the east coast of Florida by midnight, and it looks like even down near Jupiter could have some tornado potential. And I look at forecast soundings all the way down to Miami. We still got a 50-knot low-level jet. But these are those moist profiles that I've been talking about. That's a relatively stable profile over the Florida Peninsula. When that green line is right next to the red line, that means it's pretty saturated all the way up. And when that dry slot comes in, though, in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, separating that green line from the red line a little bit, it creates instability when dry moves over moist. But there's your hodograph still, which is your wind shear plot. So it's got that strong low-level shear with that 1 kilometer wind out near 50 knots, folks. So I think you're going to get a round of nocturnal tornado potential in Florida. Looks like some of these wispy supercell structures that could even threaten the Orlando area by about midnight into 1 p.m. You got to wonder how much convection there's going to be behind the lead convective line that's offshore by about 2 a.m. It does look like the models kind of take one particular storm near Lake Okeechobee from south of Fort Myers all the way across the Florida Peninsula, and then eventually moving offshore near the Jupiter area. And then this thing really ramps up in the Gulf Stream, just off the Carolinas. These are all supercell structures. The elevated mix layer is able to catch up to the convective line right there. And that's when I think this thing's really going to start to intensify. The convective line is down near Georgia by this time. And some of these on the nose of that definitely do look supercellular. By about 7 a.m., near the Savannah area, the convective line is going to be located. This thing's going to feel like a tropical storm. Big squalls coming on shore, big convective line, 14Z. And then things really get interesting once the elevated mix layer comes on shore a little bit into eastern South Carolina. There might be some breaks in the clouds. Look at these little bean-shaped supercells that'll be coming ashore near central South Carolina. Forecast soundings do look supportive of tornado potential, even though you got a little bit of stable air right there behind the line, behind the convective line. As you go toward 19Z, you get a little bit more of these supercell structures that are starting to move inland a little bit more. So, and look at that, more surface-based instability as the elevated mix layer arrives. Let me pop this over to the left, and you can really see the elevated mix layer in all its glory. That's a dry slot that comes in the mid-levels of the atmosphere right here. That's your dry slot. See how the green line is separated from the red line a little bit? When that dry slot comes over top, this deep moisture at the low levels, that creates instability. And this is an amazing hodograph here for tornado potential for a north-northwest mover at about 50 knots, like a 40-knot shear vector. That looks quite incredible, quite a shear profile there. A lot of easterly winds through the profile, almost like in the northeast quadrant of a tropical cyclone. So these look like tornado producers here as they come ashore, and that includes like Charleston to Myrtle Beach area by tomorrow afternoon. Maybe even a little bit inland right along that coastal front. You have the surface low that's intensifying here. You just have this conveyor belt of supercell storms coming on shore. There's your surface low. 985 millibars. You got to be kidding me with that. I'll pop over, say hi to everybody here on the chat. Thanks everybody for dominating that like button. Yeah, Weather Chase and Jason. Thanks new Team Dominator members for tuning in. Hi everybody. I'm about to go pump iron today too and just think about my plan for the chase. But if you think that I should be headed down to the Carolinas, drop that in the comments. If you think I should be heading down toward Florida, drop that in the comments. Never stop chasing is most important though. And this is a 985 low. And you can see a little bit earlier when it's over the northern Florida Peninsula, it's approaching as a 1,000 millibar low. Gets a little bit closer to 997. 996. Let's see what the regular NAM model has, the latest model. 997. So the NAM model also kind of has this later intensification than some of the other models we're showing. So, and look at that 989 lifting inland to South Carolina up across the Florence area. So morning model guidance is taking this a little bit further inland, folks. 992 by the NAM. And there's a big difference when you're chasing a hurricane and the hurricane is intensifying, approaching the coastline. That rips a lot different than a hurricane that's weakening. You may remember Hurricane Idalia here in the Nature Coast. That was undergoing an eyewall replacement cycle, weakening a bit. But then you remember Ian that came in down near Fort Myers, an intensifying hurricane, and definitely makes a difference if you're on the immediate coastline or a little bit inland too, because of the friction of the earth will act to slow down some of those wind speeds. So it's interesting here behind that lead convective line, you get a little bit of destabilization. This would be the lead convective line, and you get kind of the development of these supercells back behind it in that environment with a little bit of instability. Let's go a little bit further north from there, folks, even over the North Carolina Outer Banks. This track kind of favors that South Carolina zone for peaking because the surface low comes inland a little bit more, and you basically get this skinny squall line moving through the eastern North Carolina Outer Banks. There's your skinny squall line. Probably going to have some tornado warnings embedded within that. Coastal erosion too, as that surface low moves by the North Carolina Outer Banks. There's the North Carolina Outer Banks there. So I'm probably going to be targeting the Charleston to Myrtle Beach area tomorrow, starting by late morning through the afternoon for that tornado threat. Look at all this stratiform rain on the backside. Normally you'd think this time of year that would be snowfall, but it's not. It's all just rain. Just rain, warm profiles happening. Hi everybody. Got this chat just dominating in here as we are breaking down this surface low that's intensifying out of the northeastern Gulf of Mexico, and especially as it approaches the South Carolina coastline. What do you guys think? Head down to South Carolina. I don't think any fringe development's possible in western North Carolina, folks. I do think that you could get maybe some rainfall, though, up there on the outer fringes of this storm. Thanks, staying along. Carolinas sound good. I think coastal South Carolina looks like the play on this thing. Welcome, new Team Dominator members, too. Jennifer, member for 12 months. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Hopefully everything's going well with everybody. JJ, Sonia, Tornado Clips, Angie, Hilburn in the house. Yeah, I could drop down to the Tampa area tonight and just drive around in the dark, drive around in the driving rain all night tonight. That is an option. Down to Florida, or I could be out here during the daytime, Sunday afternoon, Eastern Carolina. And look at that reinvigorated convection kind of right on the back side of that low. almost like a weird little sting jet right on the north side of the low, right where those winds shift to a northwesterly direction. You get that area of kind of some intense convection. Weird. One of those northerlies. But this is the conveyor belt that we're going to be watching in North Carolina tomorrow afternoon. And this is going to be responsible for creating that wind shear. See where that yellow comes on shore? That's South Carolina, and maybe even just behind that lead convective line, you still hang on to that decent low-level wind shear. A little bit more instability, though, for supercell storms to kind of move into that environment. Let's go forward to 19Z, which is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And look at that. You still get 60 knots right into Charleston. 60 knots. There's your axis, 72 knots. And you have a little bit better instability, I think, just behind that line. Look at that elevated mix layer coming in. This is a very key part for severe weather in the central and eastern U.S., folks. Look at that nice photograph out here, too. Almost a due northerly moving supercell, like 40, 50 knots there. You can read these numbers on the sounding. That gives you an idea of the magnitude of the low-level wind shear. And look at some of those numbers. 283, 275, near 300 storm relative helicity. Those are high numbers, and that's because of these strong barbs and some directional shear at the low levels. At the very low levels of the atmosphere, you do have a little bit of directional shear. Strong due southerlies, 50 to 60 knots. Ventilation too. Definitely driving these kind of due south and north storm motions, but the conveyor belt's going to be southeast and northwest, but any right-moving supercells will be able to turn right and be a little bit more closer to due south to north. If you just had some cold air coming down, then you'd be talking about a major snowstorm like the superstorm in '93. But you don't really have that cold air diving south with this system. You'd have a lot more baroclinicity if that were the case. There's your storm over the southeastern U.S. Strong low-level jet on the east side. Asymmetric, of course. And you do have an upper-level trough. Look at that upper-level trough. You get a lot of these storm systems across the southern U.S. during El Nino because you have an energized subtropical jet down there. Southern branch of the jet is very energized. There's your subtropical jet. There's your polar front northern branch of the jet. Just a classic El Nino pattern. And a decent area of cold air aloft, minus 17 degrees C, diving south with that upper level storm system. So you do have, it's a cold core system, obviously. Not a warm core tropical system, but obviously an extra tropical system. A little bit of tilt too. Your main trough axis is upstream. Your surface low will be probably down near Savannah, Georgia, so you do have a little bit of tilt too, whereas hurricanes usually are a lot more vertically stacked. But all your cold air is still way up in Canada, north of that northern branch of the jet stream, so we're not getting that big snowstorm like we could get. You'd think eventually winter would arrive, but I'm not seeing it in the long range, at least, all the way through Christmas. Maybe way out here, it looks like there's a trough moving into the western U.S. Could represent the arrival of some decent snow across the Mountain West after Christmas and a little bit closer to New Year's. This trough could be interesting, but this could be more of a severe weather type of a trough here, folks. And this is what I've been watching to kind of break this heat wave. Usually at the end of these heat waves, you'll get a period of severe weather that'll break it. And we're getting a lot of warm temperatures in the central U.S. through Christmas. And then you're going to see this trough probably come in after Christmas, a little bit closer to the New Year. And it almost has a similar trough shape to that last one that we had that caused all those tornadoes in Tennessee. Tons of tornadoes, but a kind of a belt of some elongated belt of stronger, bit of upper level flow downstream of that trough, little asymmetric, not a ton of flow on the backside of it. But these positively tilted troughs like this can certainly go big as well. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Yeah, you should worry about wind speeds down west of Lakeland. You could probably get some decent winds, especially if you get that convection. Wherever you get a storm, you're going to get those winds that could be severe, 50, 60 miles an hour, causing some damage. And you also could get any surface-based storms that are able to develop in that environment could have tornado potential too, even though it's downtrending in my mind a little bit in Florida because of the later intensification of the surface low. There's a lot of milky skies, a lot of warm advection, weaker lapse rates downstream across Florida. So, meanwhile, though, the coastal South Carolina area is uptrending in my mind for the tornado potential. So, that's why I'm probably thinking I'll end up heading down toward coastal South Carolina for this update. Good heavens, thank you. Matt Paget, Siberia's getting cold. Yeah, there is some cold air on that side of the world, and that'll probably be associated with some big snow as well. I have seen the updates that have been talking about that El Nino might be waning, and so I want to take a look at that really quick too, everybody, because I don't buy it. I think that the Eastern Pacific El Nino is probably going to be Eastern Pacific El Nino should continue through the spring, and that's kind of what we based our tornado forecast on as well. So you can look at the subsurface weekly sea surface temperature anomalies by the Climate Prediction Center. And here, oh, I got rid of that animation. You gotta be kidding me. Stand by. Why is my watch just blowing up? Oh, I got it. There it is. So here is the animation. By depth, so you can kind of see what El Nino is doing just under the surface. And of course the oranges there are above normal. The brown there is way above normal. And boy, it looks to me like below the surface, you've got a lot of these very warm anomalies that are only even filling in. I think it's possible that that article could have been referencing this weakening area of subsurface cold air, but look at it just get dominated by the El Nino. So you're looking at the date line right here, right down the middle. This would be South America. Slopes up, of course. So you want to start looking for these waves that'll break off down here, cold anomalies that are able to kind of propagate up that slope, that temperature gradient. And then if they're able to surface in the eastern tropical Pacific as neutral or cold anomalies, then that'll start to begin the transition away from this dominant eastern Pacific El Nino. But you look below the surface, and you've still got very strong anomalies down there. There's your thermocline. A little bit lower with El Nino too. And what happens, what will trigger the change is when these cold temperatures start to surface out of the eastern tropical Pacific, then you'll start to get the ocean will respond. Usually the ocean responds first, and then the atmosphere will respond. You'll get an intensification of the easterly trade winds along the tropical and subtropical belt, and that'll lead to more upwelling, and then you'll start to get a change from an El Nino to a La Nina. But I don't anticipate that to happen until next summer. I think that this mature eastern Pacific El Nino is just going to be continuing. At least through the spring. And that's what we based our forecast on too. And look at the sea surface temperatures. So I was just showing you what was happening underneath the surface, and then these are sea surface temperature patterns. And located upstream in North America is the large body of water, the largest body of water on the planet, the Pacific Basin. And the Pacific Basin has these sea surface temperature patterns that also have a subsurface component. You've also got this very warm water on the western edge of the North Pacific Oscillation, which should propagate into the North Central Pacific by spring. So we should have kind of a rare combination of this warm NPO in the North Central Pacific and a mature Eastern Tropical Pacific El Nino. You do have a lot of these cold anomalies further south. I think that's because of the energized jet stream that has been causing a more active than normal severe weather season across the South American tornado alley, including the Pampas. And of course, Gulf of Mexico is still very warm as well. These cold anomalies here, that's the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. That's the horseshoe-shaped area of cold anomalies. That's left over from our last La Nina, where we had 3 years of La Nina conditions. Might be seeing some of this in the subsurface here start to erode the southeastern portion of the El Nino zone. Maybe a little bit of upwelling is increasing from south to north. If that happens, then it could change the sign here to a neutral or even La Nina conditions before the spring. If that happens, then we might have kind of a 2011 type of a sea surface temperature pattern where you get an erosion of these anomalies with cold water in the eastern Pacific. You get a focusing of the El Nino zone in the central tropical Pacific with warm, and then you get a warm NPO kind of telegraphing these warm anomalies out into the central tropical Pacific. So if you get this type of a configuration, PDO goes neutral, then who knows, maybe we'll have a 2011 type tornado season with or 2015 type tornado season with an active Dixie Alley and an active tornado alley for tornadoes. But please check out our recent video, our latest video on our seasonal forecast, where we make a stab at predicting the 2024 tornado season. Are they running ads on here? Sorry, everybody. That's why I got to do these for members, for Team Dominator members more often. Yeah, 97, 98 was a big El Nino, Eastern Tropical Pacific El Nino, very mature. 2015, you had kind of a weaker El Nino in the Pacific, but you did have a warm Northeastern Pacific, kind of a warm NPO, but a little bit further east. And 2015 was a big time tornado season from Dixie Alley all the way through the plains. That's right, Bill. I was headed up to see my friend up in Asheville, and an aircraft ended up crash landing on I-26. Everybody survived, but if I was about 30 seconds faster, then that aircraft might have ended up coming down on top of me there, so got pretty close. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Hopefully everybody has a great rest of your Sunday. Thank you, Straight Southern, for the hot dog money. Big fan of hot dogs. And if I head down to coastal South Carolina tomorrow, I'll be eating some of those. So that's your first super chat on a stream too. Straight Southern. Must be somebody down in coastal South Carolina down there. Oh, I was fine. I could smell the crash, but I never actually saw the aircraft, the crash. I saw emergency vehicles rip by, headed toward the location, of course. Yeah, I'm doing a lot of these live streams to break down the forecast, even though they don't do as well. They don't seem to get as many views, of course. It's just easier to break it down in real time for you guys live. A little easier for me. And it's a lot more raw, too. Here is the elevated mix layer. This is what we're tracking, and it is lagging way to the west of the Florida Peninsula all day today. And so the severe weather threat in the Florida Peninsula is probably not going to increase until after midnight, if you ask me, just because this thing is just barely chugging along. But once that elevated mix layer starts to just impinge on the west coast of Florida tonight near midnight, that's when we're going to see that tornado threat begin to increase. Fort Myers up toward the Tampa area. And then that surface low is going to track across northern Florida, right up coastal Georgia and South Carolina. And it's probably going to bring that elevated mix layer with it. Just have to keep an eye on that. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in this Saturday. Hopefully you enjoy my weather reports. Thank you, Team Dominator members, for making all these possible. And probably going to be heading down to coastal South Carolina tomorrow. May activate a live stream down there, if I can get Brian to join in on this Sunday. But thanks, everybody. And just say, never stop chasing 10 times in a row and make it true. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.